Good morning. I'm Natalie Mcsherry, President of the Maryland State Bar Association. For 125 years, the Maryland State Bar Association has been the home and the voice of the entire legal profession in Maryland. We continue to serve over 40,000 professionals around the state and beyond, including attorneys, judges, paralegals, and law students. We connect our members and the public with important leaders around the state, and we talk about the issues that matter to you. In this election cycle, we've already conducted interviews with gubernatorial candidates, and we will host debates with those candidates this summer at our legal conference in Ocean City and again in the fall. My co-host today is Bobby Zirkin, a former state senator and attorney who works with the MSBA on our advocacy efforts. Our current Attorney General, Brian Frosh, is retiring after an incredible career where he has served Marylanders on the local and national level and had an excellent relationship with the MSBA and with the MSBA's Access to Justice Commission. We look forward to having the same relationship with the next Attorney General of the great state of Maryland. And to that end, we are meeting today with Judge Katie O'Malley, who is one of the candidates to be the next Attorney General for Maryland. So welcome.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Bobby.
To start off, Judge, the Maryland State Bar Association, as I said, is the largest statewide association representing a wide array of attorneys. We have members at all stages of their careers. We have senior members, and we have younger lawyers and even law students. So one question that I think would be of interest to many of them would be, why did you choose a career in public service? Why is that important to you?
Well, I grew up in a family that has a long history in public service, and so I've been campaigning since I can remember for various family members, my father, my uncle, my other uncle, and so it was around me throughout my childhood and adult life, and it inspired me, my father especially, as a trial lawyer for many, many years before he became Attorney General. It inspired me to go into the law, to practice law, and to be a public service lawyer through working in the state's attorney's office for a decade and then being a district court judge for the past 20 years.
So can you point to anything in particular in that career that's prepared you especially well to serve as the Attorney General for Maryland?
So many things. As a state's attorney, I worked with investigators, investigating simple misdemeanors all the way up to felonies, murder cases, arguing hundreds of cases before judges and jurors. Gives you sort of an intuitive feel about the law and about your cases. And when you're leading the Attorney General's office, when you are the Attorney General leading that office with so many assistant state's attorneys, assistant attorney generals going in and out of the courthouses across our state, you need to have that legal background and experience of being a trial lawyer and practicing in front of judges and juries to give that advice to them and to help lead them throughout all the different stages of litigation, whether it's district court, circuit court, our appellate courts, and certainly our Attorney General, under my dad's 20 years, went to the Supreme Court twice, as well as his assistant attorney generals had 13 different cases that went to the Supreme Court. So it's an important role for a lawyer that can lead lawyers based on their experiences.
So why now? Why do you seek the office at this point in time in your career?
Well, after being in the courtrooms for 30 years, I feel as though I can do something different. I enjoyed being a trial lawyer. I enjoyed being a trial judge, and I really have, the desire to get back into the courtroom as an advocate and to advocate for Marylanders on every level of government. If
you were elected Attorney General, what do you see as the focus of the job of the Attorney General?
The focus is kind of three-pronged. You have to protect Marylanders, whether it's through criminal justice, the environment, or consumer protection. You have to serve the interests of the state at every level of government. And you have to attract and retain the brightest lawyers that we can get across our state to serve as assistant attorney generals so that they can represent Marylanders, again, in consumer protection, crime, criminal justice reform, and protecting our environment.
Well, I was going to ask you what your top three priorities would be, but you just rattled off three things. Would those be your priorities if you became Attorney General?
Yes, I think, protecting Marylanders, whether we're protecting consumer rights, protecting our environment, our drinking water, our precious bay, and retaining the best and brightest lawyers to do those is very, very important. So being able to make the Office of Attorney General the top legal law firm for our state, handling simple simple cases up to really complicated sort of consumer protection issues like the multi-state lawsuit that was filed against Purdue Pharma and joining other states to do that. And I know the legislature right now is looking to give the Attorney General extra powers to go against fossil fuel companies that are responsible for climate change. I think the state Attorney General in Delaware, Attorney General Jennings, just entered into a lawsuit like that.
Well, and so Attorney General Brian Frosh was known for representing Maryland in cases that went beyond the borders of Maryland, such as environmental cases and the emoluments cases. Do you see that as an important role, or would it play as big a part if you were Attorney General?
Definitely. I think Maryland's interests, especially when it comes to the environment, there's 7 Bay states, and being able to join with those other Bay states in litigation to protect our Bay and our environment would be very important. Along with, the Attorney General recently entered into litigation with other states involving student loan fraud. So that's an area that I think, we certainly would pursue that, as well as the Purdue Pharma multi-state litigation involving the opioid crisis.
I know I'm keeping Senator Zirkin from jumping in here, so feel free.
Go ahead.
Nope, it's all good.
So, first of all, again, thanks for being here with the Bar Association. I'm going to ask about some specific issues, and I know on your website you talked a lot about criminal justice reform. I guess as an open-ended question, I guess it's 2 parts. What is your vision for criminal justice reform, but also what role does the Attorney General, or what role will the Attorney General play in criminal justice reform?
So the Attorney General's office has a large role to play when it comes to crime and curbing crime and dealing with violence across the state, and that's through the Organized Crime Division. And it's a very important division because it does these multi-jurisdictional prosecutions with the U.S. Attorney's Office, as well as with the DEA and ATF, as well as local police officers and state police. And so curbing violent crime, curbing gun violence would be a big priority in my office, and working with the other assistant state's attorneys. Making sure, though, at the same time that we're curbing violent crime and protecting our citizens, that we're also making sure that the police are transparent and accountable. And that's a huge issue and has been a huge issue across the nation. But last year, the state legislature passed Anton's Law, which was a really comprehensive package of laws that was doing just that, making law enforcement more transparent and accountable to our citizens. One of the things that they added to that was creating a role for the Attorney General, which is through the investigations divisions. It's an independent investigations division. So whenever there's a civilian death that results as a result of police interaction, whether it's a shooting or whether it's a car accident, the Attorney General independently investigates that to determine whether or not the police overstepped their bounds and committed a crime. Right now, the Attorney General investigates it and makes a decision, but doesn't have the authority to prosecute those cases. And I think that's a mistake. And I think if you're going to give the Attorney General the authority to investigate, the AG's office should also have the ability to then prosecute if they feel it's necessary. And even prosecuting with the jurisdiction's assistant state's attorneys, doing it together, just to make sure that the public knows that it's an independent investigation and being prosecuted independently of the police, so the police aren't policing themselves.
All right. One of the facets of the police reform had to do with the MPIA, the Maryland Public Information Act. And one of the controversies of it had to do, and I believe this was in Anton's Law, had to do with the publication of and the reproduction of records of the police officer, even when they were found not to have done anything wrong, essentially, that they were, but they were all to be open anyway. Do you have any thoughts on that? It's a continuing raging controversy down in Annapolis, and one that was handled kind of with the eye on transparency last year, but police have been concerned about their own safety and about things getting out into the public where they don't quite understand that they actually didn't do anything wrong. Any thoughts on MPIA or where we should be?
So the law was passed, and there's been a lot of bumps in the road since October when it became effective. Some jurisdictions are claiming that they can't comply with it, that it's too expensive or they don't have the manpower to provide these documents. But I really think the spirit of the law is to make the police department accountable and transparent. And I can tell you that it hasn't always been the case, and there's really a need for that. When I was a sitting judge, I actually was in the middle of a trial and listening to these 2 police officers who have later been removed from our Baltimore City Police Force. Long story short, they lied under oath. And I made a finding, and it was not, I made that finding as a judge that these two officers had, in fact, I didn't believe their testimony, and I believe that they had actively lied under oath. And you don't do that lightly as a judge, because that should, in fact, have a ripple effect, and that can basically end their career. So I jumped off the bench after that case and called the Internal Investigations Division, and there was never any follow-up. Nobody ever got back to me to talk about it, to say that this is what's happening with the complaint, this is what we've decided to do. They didn't have to agree with me and remove the police officers, but I felt as though there should have been some accountability there. And I mean, if you're a sitting judge and you make a complaint about a police officer and nobody gets back to you, just think how it is to be a normal citizen who might have a very legitimate complaint and not get anything back. So I know since the consent decree in Baltimore City, things have certainly changed, and are, I'm sure, getting much better when it comes to accountability when people call and complain. But I think when you work for the public, like I did as a judge, like the police officers, the many good men and women who work for our citizens, they have to be transparent and accountable. There can't be any secrets.
Okay. Let me switch for a second to another hot topic, and it is in the courts right now, as we all know, and that's redistricting. The governor has, since he was elected, talked about having an independent commission and trying to take it away from political gerrymandering. It's something that every state unfortunately does. What are your thoughts, I guess, about redistricting, and maybe any predictions for us, since you just removed yourself from the bench to run for Attorney General? Any thoughts about where we will be at the end of this process with everything at the Court of Appeals right now?
Oh, if I only knew. If I only knew. So, with the pains of redistricting every decade, the census shows us that populations have gone different ways and people need to be represented differently. And the Governor's Commission, I think, was selected by just the governor. And I don't think there was any input from the legislators, if I recall reading about that. So there was his commission, his map, and then the legislative map, which passed. And now Attorney General Frosch will be defending that map because it doesn't violate the Constitution based on what I've read and from his perspective. So oftentimes, I know sometimes you don't always agree with the governor, and I have not always agreed with a governor that I was married to. But when you're the Attorney General, you have to represent what is right and what's constitutionally sound. And I think this legislative map that the legislature has voted on and passed is going to be defended by the Attorney General, and hopefully will survive the constitutional questions that are being brought up by the opponents.
It is an interesting question. I was wondering, and I know Natalie has asked this type of question also, we've talked a great deal about it. The Attorney General represents the governor and the executive branches, and also represents the legislature, and so they're in conflict with each other right now over an issue like that. Like, how does something like that get decided when you're the Attorney General and maybe you have an opinion, and it may or may not, and now you have the two branches of government disagreeing with each other about something that's in the court?
So it's the same branch, it's the executive branch, and you sometimes are going to disagree with your client as an attorney, and you will give your client the best legal advice that you can and following the rule of law, which is so very important. And I think I'm very hopeful that we'll have a Democratic governor this next go around, and that we'll have me as the Attorney General, and we'll be able to work together on a consistent basis. But there will be times when elected officials don't agree, and you, as the Attorney General, when you give advice to the governor, you give it based on what the law says and what's best for Marylanders, and I will do that.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
and I've often wondered about this. Is your client, in that instance where the governor and the legislature disagree, is your client the governor, or is your client the legislature, which is the state of, they're both the state of Maryland, so
Right.
they're both
your
client.
clients, and you give the best advice. Right now, the Governor Hogan's not really litigating as the opponent, even though the groups that are opposing the map, I believe, are certainly would like
Supporting his view.
Supporting his view, would support his map that he had presented. So you represent the governor, and you represent the General Assembly, and you represent all Marylanders, and again, based on what the law says, what the rule of law is, you do your best to represent that. And oftentimes there have been disagreements between Attorney General Frosch and the governor, and Attorney General Frosch is such a gentleman, he sends a letter and says, I think this needs to be done, and sometimes he has to publicize that. I don't think it's happened that often publicly, but it's a fine line.
Fair enough, sorry.
That's all right. No, jump in anytime. You mentioned environmental protection, and I wanted to dig into that a little bit and just see, specifically, what are your priorities? I was involved in, for example, the ban on fracking in the state, but it has limited effect other than within the the walls of Maryland because of what's going on in West Virginia or what have you. I guess, what do you see as the top priorities for the next Attorney General in terms of protecting the environment, which is obviously a big focus of Brian Frosch's as well?
Right. There's so many issues when we're talking about our environment. Is it the bay? Is it the air? Is it the land? All Marylanders have a human right to clean, free of pollutants in our environment. And I think there are many prongs that have to be addressed. We have to talk about the Chesapeake Bay. There was a blueprint that was done to get our bay back to where it should be, eliminating the dead zones and getting rid of nitrogen and phosphorus and runoff from different farming issues. So we need to make sure that we're on track with what that blueprint was supposed to be doing. I believe it started in 2010. And right now, we're not. And I think as the Attorney General, what I'd like to do is make public what the tracking is. So start tracking the amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus that's in the bay. Keep track of how many dead zones we have, how many we've eliminated. Keep track of the oyster reclamation efforts that we've been trying to do since 2010, and have that publicized so people know where we are as a government. I know the Chesapeake Bay Foundation does a report card every year, but I think quarterly the Attorney General should be making those standards that we're trying to achieve public to see where we're getting, so that all of the elected officials across the board can work harder to make sure that we're doing those things. There's a bill that's being presented in the Senate, I believe this session, and it's from Senator Kramer. It's called about the Climate Comprehensive Plan. And it would require each jurisdiction across the state to come up with a comprehensive plan for their jurisdiction, for their county, for their city, and submit it every 3 years to the Department of the Environment, so that on a state level, the executive branch can look at what those plans are and make it cohesive. Because one county can do one great thing and another county can do another thing, but they're not working together. They can sometimes be offsetting the goals that they're trying to create for a better environment. So we really do need to do it more on a comprehensive level.
Do you want to jump in?
No.
I have actually two historical things I wanted to add. Lots of issues to talk about, but two things that I recall you being involved in were same-sex marriage and the cyberbullying issue with Grace, with the McComas family, Grace's Law. And I guess the question is, those aren't issues that are before the next Attorney General, but I guess, if you could talk to your involvement in that and kind of how that shaped your view of how to deal with the legislature and so forth, because I remember those were two big fights that you were involved in.
They were, and being a judge, you're not supposed to be partisan, but I really don't believe, and I didn't believe back when I was fighting for these different rights, that urging people to vote for marriage equality was not a partisan issue. It's an issue of dignity, and every person has the right to love whom they want to love, and our state should acknowledge that and recognize that for families. So I felt like it was a civil rights issue, and it didn't really involve partisan. There were Republicans and Democrats who were for marriage equality. So I really tried to behind the scenes work on that issue, and at one point I think I said something that got in the press about how I thought that some of the legislators might be cowards when they weren't voting for it, but it was not that they were cowards because they disagree with me. It was a completely separate issue. And I'm proud of the work that I did to make sure that Marylanders could all vote for marriage equality, and that we actually did get it through the legislature, and it makes us a better state for it. When it comes to Grace's Law, that really hit hard because I had done so much work on anti-bullying in the schools, in the public schools across our state. It had become such a huge issue, and it did affect not just LGBTQ youth. It affects, bullying in so many different ways affects kids, but it really was different from when I was growing up, because you could leave school, you could leave the schoolyard and get home and get on your internet, and there could be Facebook, and there could be text messages, there could be, all kinds of things out there in the public that were furthering whatever the bullying issue was when you even got home. So kids couldn't escape it. And sadly, one young woman from Howard County had taken her own life after she just couldn't handle it anymore. So I know you worked really hard on that legislation, and we were happy to get that passed so that now, There's a pretty comprehensive cyberbullying legislation in the state of Maryland now. So, and it's Grace's law.
Let me ask you this, and we talked about this a little earlier. You mentioned getting some of the best and brightest to work in the Attorney General's office. It's a huge law firm, basically, right?
The largest in the state.
I think so. Well, if you don't count those ones that are multi-state, you know. So how would you manage, from a managerial standpoint, how would you manage the broad scope of the responsibilities of that office?
The way I would approach managing that office is sort of the way that I've approached managing large dockets on a daily basis when it comes to either housing or landlord-tenant issues, where you have 1,000 cases on your docket and you have a variety of different issues. And as the leader of the courtroom for 20 years, making sure that people were talking to whom they were supposed to be talking to, where they were getting the services where they needed to, and then being able to manage. It's almost intuitive, if you would, when you're in the courtroom. And in an office with 400 plus lawyers, you want to retain and attract the best and the brightest lawyers that you can. And we have such great law schools in our state, with the University of Baltimore and with the University of Maryland, that I would like to start like intern programs to get all of these smart students into the Office of the Attorney General and get them excited about working there, and making sure that your deputies, when you're talking about actual management, that you have deputies that have experiences in diverse ways. You know, right now there's 2 deputies working in the AG's office, and one focuses primarily on the civil side of the office and the litigation, and the other one primarily focuses on the criminal aspects of the office. Not that they don't intersect often, because like you said, it's such a large law firm that there are so many issues that do, and making sure that you have just the best and the brightest lawyers, like the Ralph Tylers that worked there, the Donna Hill Staten. You had some really great, bright lawyers working in that office, Eleanor Carey. So that's
So as you
caliber.
say, back in the day, people like that would come, and some stayed, like Ralph and Ellie Carey. But when I was a young lawyer, it was not uncommon, and this might have been when your dad was the Attorney General, I think, for young lawyers to leave a law firm that they were already with and established with, and with their law firm's blessing, go work at the Attorney General's office for 2, 3, 4 years, and then come back. You know, first taking their expertise that they'd gained as a young lawyer in a law firm with them to the AG's office, and then come back with now presumably specialized knowledge in some area of state government or state law. Nowadays, we see a lot more career assistants, attorneys general. Do you think one is better than the other, and if so, which one?
I think that they're both great. You know, it is wonderful to have a lawyer come and then stay in the Attorney General's office and get that experience, especially the trial experience that the Attorney Generals get, because they are litigating cases from district court, circuit court, to the appellate courts, and to the Supreme Court, depending on which agency they're in. So having the ability to attract individuals who've come from firms to get them trained in those areas, I think is great, and hopefully, if they stay, even better. Right now there's a program where the U.S. Attorney's Office is taking some of the Attorney Generals and having an exchange for about 2 years, and those Attorney Generals get to work in the U.S. Attorney's Office with the strike force and deal with all those complicated federal criminal cases, and then come back to the Organized Crime Division, which does all these multi-jurisdictional, gun trafficking, human trafficking, and drug trafficking cases for our state. So that kind of exchange is also working. It's the flip side of what you said, but it's getting these attorneys over to the U.S. Attorney's Office to train them to have them come back and be better litigators for the state of Maryland.
Do you see any benefit to having assistant attorneys general who have actually had to answer to a client, as we say in the real world? As you know, state is one thing. I recently heard a federal appellate judge ask a government lawyer, and I will try to imitate his accent too, where he said, "Sir, have you ever had a real client? I mean, like a real client, not the government." So I think that's real, though.
That's very good, Natalie.
I try. But I mean, and I, as someone who does litigate against assistant attorneys general from time to time, I wonder whether it wouldn't be beneficial for the Office of the Attorney General to have people who had to answer to a real client, not the government, and to understand the practicalities of the practice of law on that side of the table. Do you think that's useful?
I think it's useful. I think it's also useful that the assistant attorney generals realize that they do have clients and that it's Marylanders. They work for the state of Maryland. They work for the people of our state, not just the agency. The agency is our people. So that's their client. And when I was an assistant state's attorney, my clients were the victims in these cases and their family members and the witnesses, and they were all my clients, and it was super important that they knew exactly what was going on every stage of litigation when I was a trial lawyer. So I would certainly instill in all of those assistant attorney generals that they do have a client, and that is, again, the people of our state.
How would you do that?
I think, first and foremost, with so many lawyers, when you first start in the office, you sit down with all the heads of the different agencies, all the, the leaders of whether they're representing the Department of the Environment or if they're, their clients, the Department of Environment, or whether it's in criminal justice, and you sit down with all of them and make sure that they understand that they do have a client, that that's the people of our state, and every action that you pursue as an attorney general and as an assistant attorney general is to further the interests of the people of our state.
So that's lovely to hear. In practice, those assistant attorneys general, though, are working on a day-to-day basis with the agency, the board, the whatever governmental unit that exists as a governmental unit.
The judiciary.
Whichever one they're working with. And over time may feel, as some lawyers do in private practice, that they come to identify with that entity, that agency, that board as their client more than, as you say, the people of the state of Maryland. What can you do to overcome that when you're the Attorney General?
I found when I was an assistant state's attorney that it was really helpful, and certainly in a much smaller office than the AG's office, it was really helpful to have monthly meetings with as many people as they possibly could. So when I was, prosecuting drug trafficking crimes, we would, have meetings once a month to talk about updates in the law and to talk about what strategies we were doing, what types of cases we were having. And I think it's really important that you have that constant contact where you're meeting with the attorneys and talking back and forth with them to find out, well, what are the issues with your agency, and what are we doing to further, again, the interests of the people of Maryland, because these agencies are all working for Marylanders. We all have the same common goal, and that's to serve the interests of our state.
You mentioned a while ago getting involved in cases on a national level that might involve complicated scientific or other topics, like the pharmaceutical cases and that sort of thing. Do you ever anticipate, as Attorney General, bringing in special talent, if you will, special attorneys to work on cases that require expertise that may not exist in the office?
Well, over the years that's happened. It's happened in the tobacco litigation. It's happened with the opioid crisis. I know that Attorney General Frosch did blind interviews from different law firms that that had specialties in those areas. So yes, I think that that's something that can be anticipated depending on what the issues are and whether or not the assistant attorney generals can or cannot handle those cases and that expertise, or the level of litigation that might be involved, like with the tobacco litigation. It's settled long before, I believe, anyone thought. So it didn't require as much work as the outside firm was going to have to do. But you need to be prepared for that. And I believe that this bill that's being presented in the Senate now for giving the attorney generals the ability to sue fossil fuel companies would be that type of litigation. The bill also entails a provision that would allow the attorney general to hire outside counsel if the expertise was not within the office. And then to conduct those, I would do blind interviews so that there wouldn't be any issue of conflicts of interest or anything.
So going back to that and to keeping the best and the brightest lawyers in the Attorney General's office, as you know, probably, there's a significant pay disparity between the assistant attorneys general and even people who have comparable jobs, let's say in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and elsewhere in state government. What, if anything, would you anticipate doing to address that, or do you think it matters?
It definitely matters, because you really want to attract the best and the brightest, and by doing that you have to be able to be competitive to pay the best and the brightest. And right now the salaries are not competitive, and I would, hopefully, again, getting a Democratic governor to realize how important it is for the citizens of our state to have the top lawyers represent the agencies, represent them, and ask for a pay increase. I think there was a governor's commission that was looking at increasing those salaries, because the Attorney General doesn't control her own budget. It is, a part of the governor's budget. So certainly advocating and strongly advocating for increases in their salaries so that we can attract and keep the best lawyers representing Marylanders.
Along those lines, the MSBA has had a great relationship with Attorney General Frosch, especially in co-chairing his task force on access to justice during the pandemic, which you may know came out with a number of proposals, some of which are in the legislature this session, having to do with access to counsel and eviction proceedings and that sort of thing. What do you see as the top access to justice issues facing Marylanders, and what, if anything, would you anticipate doing to address them?
There's so many. And being a trial judge for the past 20 years, I have seen just how disadvantaged a person can be when they come to court without counsel, and whether it's in eviction cases, which happens way too often, or whether it's in protective order hearings. The disparity of the inability to really articulate what they need and how to present evidence has made people very disadvantaged when it comes to access to justice, specifically in those two areas that I saw. So increasing through advocating with the legislature, increasing the ability to have a person represented at an eviction proceeding, just like you have a public defender in a criminal case, I think would be something I would be very strongly advocating for, as well as getting attorneys to represent petitioners in protective order cases, because again, they can be very disadvantaged in not knowing how to present their evidence. I had a case, a story actually, of a woman who had gone before a judge to get a protective order and it was denied. And the only way I found out about it, I was living in Annapolis at the time, was she had a very good friend that told me what had happened and started telling me about the hearing and what this woman had said, and I could tell that she hadn't articulated exactly what was going on. So I had coffee with her and met with her, and it was, long story short, a really scary, lethal situation, and she didn't have anywhere to go because she didn't want to go to any of her kids' homes who were grown because her spouse owned firearms legally, and she was really, really nervous. And the violence was ratcheting up, and it was getting more and more lethal. So I had her stay at Government House for a few nights so she could sleep because she was living out of her car. And she then went back to the court. She was able to articulate exactly what was going on and to talk about the firearms and the lethality of the situation, and she got her order. A few weeks later, he found out where she was, and he tried to kill her. He had tied her up in their home and poured gasoline all around the house and had his guns, and she was able to send a text message without him knowing to her friend, just said help. So the police arrived. It was a really sad situation. When he saw the police at the door, he killed himself. He didn't kill her. But it's imperative that people have services, whether it's on a pro bono basis, it's great, but the House of Ruth can't do it all. There are as many courthouses as they possibly can be. There's just so many lethal situations out there where life and death is a matter. So having counsel for those types of cases would be something I would advocate for.
Do you see any role for the Attorney General's office, you mentioned pro bono, in allowing assistant attorneys general to actually provide pro bono services?
In consumer protection, there is a volunteer, I believe, I know ever since my dad was AG, they would get retired attorneys to sit and talk with people about their different legal issues and help them mediate situations. Issues involving, sale of a house or a car that they purchased, minor sort of issues like that. So there is a pro bono component already through consumer protection. I think it would be great if the work of the Attorney General, it's already so massive. I don't know if they would have actually the time to get assistant attorney generals to do that, because, and then there might be conflicts depending on what type of cases they're representing people on. It might get complicated.
Well, the conflicts I get, of course, that's what we hear from private lawyers too, is where there's so much demand on our time already, how can we possibly do pro bono work? Mm-hmm. But do you see any role for the Attorney General's office in educating the public about issues that might arise?
That's a huge role in the Attorney General's office, and I think that that has been historically part of what the Attorneys General have been doing around our country, and specifically in Maryland. I know there was an initiative to give more awareness to where people could get help and services, and by contacting the Attorney Generals in hair salons for domestic violence, because that was a way that you could do it perhaps without the person's partner knowing and getting that information. Also, when it comes to the living wills, that's something that you can look at online through the Attorney General's office. When it comes to vulnerable adults, how to protect a loved one from fraud and from physical violence, and where seniors can go if they believe that they're being targeted in a financial exploitation situation or physically exploited and or abused. So there's all kinds of ways the Attorney General's office does provide information on legal services for a variety of different things.
I've been hogging all the time.
No, it's been enjoying the conversation. I'm going to turn back to some more issues. One in particular, and it's interesting to talk about the federal and the state. And one of the issues that started during the O'Malley administration was the whole issue of medical cannabis. And fast forward till today, and in Annapolis, as we speak, they're talking about the recreational legalization of cannabis. And I just curious as to your thoughts about that, what you've seen on the bench, but also, the interesting, I guess, dilemma to some extent that the federal government continues to have this as an illegal drug, no different than heroin or crack, where the state is has moved forward with medical, and it seems on the precipice of doing it for recreational use. And how you marry those two things together when the state is essentially violating federal law?
Well, other states' rights, are an issue though. So Colorado has already done this, other states have done this, and Maryland is seeking to do it now, and sort of phasing it in, because recreational marijuana right now, and then if it goes to a referendum, if it passes, how will we phase that in, and how are we going to look at the effects of recreational marijuana on teenagers, on pregnant women, on senior citizens, and doing studies all along, so we make sure we're doing this in a smart, systematic way. What I have seen over the years, as a trial judge, I have signed hundreds and hundreds of warrants for murders and for attempted murders, all involving a scenario where somebody was purchasing or selling marijuana. And firearms are a part of the sale, usually, because there's a large amount of quantity and there's a large amount of money, and it's lethal. And it's so sad to see, the lives that have been lost from people just trying to purchase marijuana. We could cut down on so much violence. So that's a positive aspect of getting recreational marijuana passed. I think we will really decrease the amount of violence we're seeing across our state. But we have to do it in a smart way, and we have to do the business regulation and licensing of it also in a smart way. We don't want to make recreational marijuana now a profit for other states and for other corporations to come into Maryland and to, make a profit off of this for us. What we need to do is make sure that the licensing and the taxation of it all goes to help those people who have been disproportionately affected by the marijuana laws in our state. That's, a lot of people in Baltimore City have been disproportionately prosecuted and put in jail a while ago. We haven't been doing that in the city of Baltimore for probably 10 years. But making these individuals whose lives have been, again, disproportionately affected by the illegal sale of marijuana, profit from the recreational sale. So I think it's an important step for many reasons, and I'm hoping that it does pass.
We had talked a little bit about crime beforehand. You've been in the state's attorney's office for many years as an assistant state's attorney, and then a trial judge for 20 years in Baltimore City. Several of the candidates running for attorney general have talked extensively about what they would do related to crime. I'm not sure that was necessarily legal or in the Constitution, but regardless of that, I guess what would you do? You talked a little bit about kind of the task forces and so forth, but from your experience, crime is running rampant in Baltimore City and other places across the state. What is it that either your office as Attorney General, but also the legislature should be looking at from your experience, particularly as a trial judge? Because people are kind of throwing their hands up. The governor has talked about increasing sentences on repeat violent offenders. Others have talked about parole and probation. There was the Justice Reinvestment Act, which did a whole host of criminal justice reforms, and it nothing seems to be sticking. And I guess just from your experience and from what you've seen, like what is the issue and why is it that we can't kind of get our hands around this?
You're right, it is a huge issue, and it's a public health issue. I mean, gun violence in our state is taking the lives of so many young men and women and children and seniors. It's affecting, when we talk about, 3 shootings in Baltimore or a shooting at the Magruder High School in Montgomery, and we talk about the shooting in Catonsville High School. I mean, these are people, these are lives, and the murder rate in Baltimore City is the highest it's been since 1973. These are people, brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers who are dying, and the effect and the trauma that it's having on our city and our state is immense. So yes, something has to be done, and yes, something can be done. I think by some politicians like to point fingers, and they like to say, oh, it's this person's fault, or it's that person's fault, it's the judges, it's the prosecutors, it's the police. What you really need in a leader, and this is the type of leader I will be, is someone who collaborates with all of these different stakeholders when we're talking about fighting crime. And since 2015, the Attorney General's office has been given a directive through the legislature to form the Organized Crime Division, which we talked briefly about. And in that Organized Crime Division, it's addressing gang violence, it's addressing violence in the correction system, it's addressing violence on the streets, it's addressing murders. The AG's office handled a numerous amount of murders. They've had 200 some prosecutions involving organized crime through gun violence and drug distribution and human trafficking, which is a big problem here in our state because of our proximity with 95. So you need a leader that's actually built cases with investigators and worked with other prosecutors and worked against defense attorneys and worked with defense attorneys for years and years and years to be able to lead that division so that we can all work collaboratively to reduce the violence and the gun violence that's affecting our state. It's a job that I can do on day one because of all the experiences I had as a prosecutor for a decade and then a trial judge for the past 20 years, listening to hundreds and hundreds of cases day in and day out that involve these issues. So I'd be the best person fit to run the AG's office, especially when it comes to the Organized Crime Division.
Why does it seem, I mean, some of the legislation, you mentioned judicial transparency, which is an issue in the General Assembly right now. Why does it seem, at least from the outside looking in, that so many of these individuals that you hear about that end up shooting somebody have had such huge records of getting in and out and probations and just not getting maybe the time that they needed, their first 3, 4, 5 times before they finally take a life? Like, what is the issue or is there one that we should be looking at, or that the legislature should be looking at, in order to get a little bit of a handle on this? Because it does seem, like in Baltimore County, the Officer Caprio murder, that the individuals that perpetrated that had this huge list of just this huge record in juveniles, and it just didn't ever seem like they ever got really anything, and they just let in and out and in and out and in and out. Is that your experience, or like, I guess it's frustrating for the public to watch this, and it just thoughts about what we should be doing?
Well, I think when it comes to the services, when we're talking about crime, criminal justice, and our entire criminal justice system, you can incarcerate, you can put people on probation, you can do pretrial, and all of these different agencies have to work together with local law enforcement. And having everybody on a different page is a problem. So the Baltimore City Criminal Justice Coordinating Commission that had been in effect before Governor Hogan got rid of it was a wonderful way for these partners to all address issues that they needed to work on. But one big problem that I have seen over the past decade as a judge is that parole and probation within the past, I would say 8 years or so, has just been not funded properly. You don't have enough parole and probation officers to manage the cases, to the caseload. And as a judge, even especially during the pandemic, I would have to call the probation officers to make sure they were coming into court because they just weren't showing up. And so it was really frustrating because you put the judge in a position of, making sure your witnesses are there, and because the state wasn't involved in it, so I didn't have a state's attorney who was doing those types of things, and it's a very complicated issue, but not so much that we can't solve it. So I can't stand when people say, oh, it's crime, and this is the way it's always been, and this is the way it's always going to be. We can't incarcerate our way out of it, but we have to start working with all of the different partners when it comes to the issues. Natalie and I were talking about the woman who was shot and killed after she dropped her son off in Annapolis for the Naval Academy by a stray bullet that hit her and sadly took her life. That gentleman had been released by a judge on 2 felonies involving firearms, and he'd been released on pretrial. He had been given home detention. He had been given an ankle bracelet on his leg. He was released in April. He cut that bracelet off in May, and that woman was killed in July. There was no reason why that should have happened. So these departments have to be more accountable, and as the Attorney General, I will work and stand on a bully pulpit, if you will, to make sure that the governor funds these agencies because they are imperative to public health and safety.
I have more, but go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'm having a good time listening. This is fascinating because most people in Maryland don't think of the Attorney General as having a big role in criminal justice, but from what you said, it sounds like you do see a role there, although not on the streets necessarily. Do you see any role for the Attorney General in working on police and community relations?
I think the Attorney General certainly can play a huge role in having police and community relationships bettered, if you will, and working with the local law enforcement agencies and community activists, bringing them together quarterly to talk about the issues that are affecting the communities and differences that they may or may not be having with law enforcement, and working with agencies like Safe Streets in Baltimore City and other organizations, nonprofits like that, would be something that I'd be very excited about doing, because people, especially in Baltimore, have a cultural distrust of the police department for very good reasons. And working with communities to try and resolve those issues in a way that people feel safe. Because, when I talk to people who come to the courthouse, they wanted the police to help them, but they didn't want the police to hurt them. And that was always the dynamic. They wanted help, but they certainly didn't want the abuse. That was a part of the culture that they believed was around the police department. So with the consent decree, I hope that things are getting better. It's going to go into its 4th year now. People still need the police and need protection, but like I said, they are nervous about it. A woman came to me when I was the duty judge. Actually, I came to her at the commissioner's office at 3 in the morning, and I brought my older son with me because my husband was out of town, and I went down to Calvert Street to give her a mental health evaluation for her son. And the things that she was telling me that had happened, his mental health issues as well as his dangerousness to himself or others, were scary because it involved a firearm. And so after I filled out the work for her to get her evaluation for her son, I said, you can also go to the commissioner and you can file criminal charges based on what you've told me, and you could also seek a protective order based on the things that you've told me, so that when he gets out of the hospital, he won't be able to come home and harm you and your other children. And she broke down in tears, and she had already been very upset. And she said, I can't do that. He's my only son left. My other son was killed on the streets, and nothing's happened for the past 2 years. I need to make sure he's safe and well. So I just broke my heart, that she was in this situation where, she didn't want to, she wanted him to get the help, but she needed him to get better. And just the despair of having lost a son to street violence and nothing ever happening to resolve that case, it really tears at your heart.
It does. As Attorney General, what can you do to address that?
Again, we have to make it so that people, when they are breaking the law in such a way that it affects people's safety, that we're being effective at finding those types of people. And I think incarceration as a judge was always the last tool in my little judge toolbox, but some people do need to go to jail. And if you're going to be monitoring people for safety issues when they're on pretrial, you need to make sure that those services that the taxpayers are paying for are actually working, and that judges, law enforcement are being notified promptly and efficiently about violations so that we can keep people safe, and working with all of those partners to do that.
Well, a few minutes ago you mentioned the Criminal Coordinating Council that used to exist in Baltimore City. Do you see any function for something like that on a state level, maybe organized by or sponsored by the Attorney General?
Well, the Attorney General actually does get involved. It was a part of the Baltimore City Coordinating Council, and Brandon Scott, our new mayor, has actually brought it back. So the Attorney General will be an active partner with that agency, as well as working more closer with the strike force, the U.S. strike force from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and being a partner with the strike force. I think right now that's sort of a part-time situation, but full-time having an Attorney General working with the strike force to identify the most violent offenders and the biggest issues with gun violence, and targeting them and making sure those cases are investigated properly and brought to court. Because right now, when I was talking to the head of the strike force, the U.S. Attorney, he said that in Baltimore City, the chances of you getting caught are 1 in 10 in a murder case. If you are caught, it's almost very, very difficult to get a conviction. So we really need to do better and to work harder. And that's really what it requires. It requires a lot of hard work and a lot of smart people working collaboratively and not pointing fingers and blaming one politician over another. And as EG, I would be a leader in that area.
For a minute, let me drag you out of the criminal arena and back to one that I'm more familiar with, which is the civil arena and the various administrative agencies that exist in the state of Maryland. You're probably aware of the fact that more and more legal disputes are getting resolved in these administrative proceedings, everything from environmental to health to education, IEP hearings, all that sort of stuff is being resolved not in the courts anymore, but in administrative hearings. And the agencies that make these decisions have incredible power and broad discretion, which is not subject to much judicial control. As the person who would be representing all those agencies with that great power, do you see any problem with that?
Well, I think representing those agencies, again, those agencies are supposed to be working for the betterment of all of our people. So making sure that that's the objective of the Assistant Attorney Generals when advising those agencies, that you, although are an Assistant Attorney General for Mass Transit is an agency that works for the betterment of the people of our state and transportation. So making sure, and it's a fine philosophical line, because people will say, well, this is my client, and it is your client, but your client works for the state. We all work for the state, and we all work for the people of our state and the taxpayers who pay our salaries. So I think that would be the philosophical approach that I would have to that issue.
Good luck. Bobby?
I have many issues, but not much time left, so I think it's probably it's time to wrap.
Okay, well then, I think it's time for us to say, what have we not covered today that you would like to make a comment on for the people who might watch this?
Thanks. I want to thank both of you for having me here and to listening to my ideas about the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General is the people's lawyer, and when you say that, it sounds kind of trite, but it really is. You are the lawyer for the people of our state, and you are the leader of Attorney Generals, Assistant Attorney Generals that go into the courthouses of our state, from district to circuit to the appellate courts and even to the Supreme Court. So as the Attorney General, I'm the leader that Marylanders should vote for, because I've been in our courts throughout our state for the past 30 years as a trial lawyer, just like my father, preparing cases, arguing cases between with hundreds of cases before judges and jurors. And that's the type of leader that the state Attorney General needs to be for all of those 400 plus assistants that will be marching into court defending Marylanders on every level of government.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and for discussing these important issues for the people of Maryland.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.